Hello, thank you for tuning into this webinar. I hope you'll find it valuable and insightful. My name is Sophie Lindvold and I work for BES Healthcare, and I've been organizing the Do No Harm, Know Your Power webinars. Before playing through the webinar, I thought I'd take a moment of your time to briefly explain our campaign, Do No Harm, Know Your Power. The campaign is inspired by changes we've seen in the healthcare system due to time pressures and financial demands, which has led clinicians to make clinical decisions that don't always lead to the best outcome for the client. These challenges have adversely affected patients, leading to an increase in harm. To change this, to do no harm, we want to empower clinicians to say no to equipment that has not been tested to its appropriate standard and give them the power to bring clinical recommendation back into the buying process and make right decisions for the best possible clinical outcome. BES works with various bodies, charities, and industry experts to make information on standards, equipment, and best practice guidelines accessible to you. We also offer free training where needed. These webinars might not change the industry overnight. Still, we feel that they are the beginning of a movement to inspire clinicians, manufacturers, and end users to look for alternative solutions that fit best clinical practice. That was my moment. Thank you for listening and enjoy the webinar. Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to our second webinar from our Do No Harm, Know Your Power campaign, where today we'll talk about early intervention in relation to pediatric care. Our panelists today are Holly Jenkins, Stephen Kingdom, and Charlotte Peck. And thank you, everyone, for wanting to join us today and share your knowledge and all your experiences. Before we start with our questions, I thought it could be great to get a brief introduction to all of our panelists. So, Holly, why don't you start sort of talking a little bit about, what you do and how your work relates to pediatric care.
Excellent. Yeah, great. Hello, everybody. My name is Holly Jenkins and I'm director at Jiraffe. Jiraffe is a part of Jenkins Limited. We're a company that manufactures and designs pediatric equipment. We're just approaching our 40th anniversary next year. So we've been
nice. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, we've been doing this for a long time. And we consider ourselves experts, I suppose, really, in pediatric equipment, provision of pediatric equipment. And that's really what we do. So we provide postural support equipment for children of all ages. Some of our equipment does tip over into adult sizes because obviously children grow and teenagers are, if they're anything like my teenagers, bigger than some adults. Yeah, so that's really what we do. And Jiraffe focuses purely on the UK market because the way we do things in the UK is different to the way it's done in the rest of the world.
Yeah, great. And how about you, Stephen?
Hi, yeah, I'm Stephen Kingdom. I'm the campaign manager of the Disabled Children's Partnership. The Disabled Children's Partnership is a coalition of, we're now more than 90 charities and other organisations who come together to campaign for better health and social care provision for disabled children and their families. And we've had a particular focus, obviously, over the last year and a bit, or year and a half or so, on the pandemic. And we've had a partnership with Pear's Foundation, called the Pear's Foundation Learning Hub, which has been particularly researching how the pandemic has impacted on disabled children, their families, their health, their social care, how they've been isolated and so on. And we published a major report last month called Then There Was Silence, which brought all that research together.
Great. And finally, Charlotte, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, hello. Yeah, so I'm Charlotte. I'm the director of Move Europe. And we're a charity that works across the UK and some areas of Europe as well to deliver a programme called the Move Programme, which is a programme aiming to give more skills in movement to children with physical disabilities. So we work across special schools at the moment. In the UK, we have about 140 special schools that we work with, and we would go in and deliver training to the whole team around that child, so therapy, education and families, to enable them to have more skills in teaching independent movement skills. But we are also beginning to work more in the mainstream sector as well of education, and we're just in the beginning stages of developing our new programme, Mini Move, which is going to be an adapted programme of the Move programme for children aged 2 to 5. So we're piloting that in conjunction with a therapy team in Wales at the moment. So that's very exciting and something we've been wanting to work on for a long time. Nice.
Love the applause, Holly. I just realized I completely forgot to mention that my lovely colleague Diane Hargrove is here as well to sort of help me with my hosting duties, just in case anyone's wondering. Great, well, thank you so much for doing that. And I know that, you know, as most people might be aware, you know, that COVID-19 has had, you know, a severe impact on our healthcare system. But Stephen, when it comes to sort of pediatric care, how has the COVID-19 pandemic sort of affected children with physical disabilities?
Yeah, so as I said, we've been researching the impact on children and families throughout the pandemic, and we had a series of surveys of parent carers, freedom of information requests of both local authorities and health trusts, interviews with parent carers, and examination of public data sets. And we also commissioned an independent evaluation of how the voluntary sector has responded. And as I said, that came together last month with the publication of Silence. And I have to say that presented a pretty devastating picture of the impact on children, both the social and health impacts. The overarching conclusion was that children and families have been isolated and abandoned and not listened to, and too often ignored as part of, during the pandemic. The restrictions, the COVID restrictions, meant that services were stopped or reduced, things like therapies, access to healthcare, and in many cases have been very slow to return. So take a couple of examples. There was an 84% reduction in pain management clinics during the pandemic, which meant, you know, children were being left in pain. Even in June, over 70% of disabled children were still unable to access the pre-pandemic levels of therapies in the health service that they had been receiving. Wow. So that's a picture of real, I mean, you can understand why at the start in March last year, services stopped. It was devastating, but you still sort of see that. But even during it, despite government messages and the lockdowns eased for other people, the message in the summer, or the evidence in the summer, was that children were still, and families were still not getting the support they needed. And this has all had a big impact on the mental health and well-being of families, with a 60% increase in referrals to paediatric emergency mental health services, and parental anxiety consistently high, with more than 80% of parent carers of disabled children having some form of anxiety. Again, that continuing despite lockdown easing. And we're talking about the sort of physical health and indeed mental health, but the physical health of children. What we've seen is children's conditions have worsened and become more complex. So to take one example of a parent we've worked with, his daughter had involuntary spasms as part of her condition. That would normally be treated and managed with some physiotherapy. That physiotherapy didn't happen. She gave herself a hernia. She had to have an operation. That's the kind of, you know, a specific case study, but the kind of examples we heard. So assessments for needs have been delayed. There was two-thirds of trusts completed fewer physiotherapy assessments in the 13-week target and the latest data than they had pre-pandemic. And the sort of overarching figure, which is really quite depressing, is that 71% of disabled children have seen their progress managing their conditions and their overall development go backwards, regress during. So that's the kind of rather stark and that'd be quite depressing picture of support having dropped, needs not being identified and picked up, and children's conditions worsening.
Wow, is this an image that that you guys recognize as well, Holly and Charlotte?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, absolutely. It's our work that we did over the pandemic mirrors the work that Stephen's organisation did, and we work, as I said, with schools, and I think 93% of our schools in last summer said that lockdown had massively affected their students' mobility. And yeah, you know, it's been like Stephen said, a stark picture for those children that still are struggling to access therapies. We're still hearing the same stories across the UK where therapists are battling a huge backlog now of their caseloads, and children are still suffering. What we did find, something that mitigated that effect, was where Move was used in schools, where schools were able to work on children's physical mobility and keep, managing their progress. Those effects were mitigated in schools where Move was really well embedded, and it just comes back to the need to, which I'm sure we'll discuss in more detail, to engage the whole team around that child, and it can't just rely on one service or one team, because if anything, the pandemic has massively highlighted that is a really risky strategy to take. So yeah, we have many case studies similar where children have regressed and are facing additional challenges now. But there are programs out there, and there is work that we can do to start to address some of those challenges.
Yeah, and I think from our point of view, I can only really mirror what Stephen and Charlotte have said. We saw exactly the same thing. Everything really, especially in the first lockdown, just fell off the edge of a cliff for children. All appointments really across the board from our perspective were just cancelled, and these are children who are in need, and those needs were just pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. And I think one of the most saddening things for me really is that we know that children have better outcomes when preventative measures are put in place, when we deal with things early before they become a problem. And what's actually happened now is that, as Charlotte said, as caseloads have built up and there's that big backlog, the prioritization is done on the children who are worse, which of course it needs to be. But those children would have avoided ever getting to that worst stage if we'd have been able to keep on top of things. And that picture is being perpetuated because we are now in the situation where we're dealing with those children with the most pressing and urgent of needs because they've deteriorated over that time. And that's taking the available resource and meaning that we're not able to work on that preventative model that we really want to be able to do, that we really should be doing in order to give children with disabilities the best possible opportunities for the rest of their lives. A number of the things that are happening to children now are things that they won't fully recover from. They will be burdened with those for the rest of their life, and it's so sad because they were avoidable. So yeah, absolutely.
And Charlotte, in your opinion, what can sort of be done to address these challenges that children and families are facing now because of the pandemic and the backlogs?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, isn't it? And I think there's so much we can be looking at. I think the work that organisations across the sector, like the Disabled Children's Partnership, are doing to raise awareness of those challenges is so vitally important. And I think if you're within the sector, you know the challenges, and it's how can we make that more widely known and make people understand the challenges that children with additional needs are facing. And you might be tempted to say we need a kind of bold reimagining of how it all works, and I'm sure that's one option. But there are examples of really good practice that are happening, and I think we can do more to showcase those examples of good practice and to replicate those. And I think those good practices come down to, as I touched on earlier, involving the whole team around that child in their physical development, if we're just taking that as an example. So, not just leaving it to health and therapy services, but doing a lot more to utilise the resources, the capacity, the knowledge, the expertise of the education system, of families, is something that we really need to be looking at, because we know from our experience that does have mitigating effects. And I think we have constant conversations of that's not within my remit, so I need to start to kind of bridge those gaps a little bit and have an investment, I suppose, of time and resource into those approaches that take a lot of work in the short term, but in the long term, like Holly said, have massive benefits to that child down the line into adulthood. So yeah, that's what we do at Move. Our acronym stands for Movement Opportunities via Education. So it literally is about incorporating the skills and knowledge of the education system, and yeah, training the whole team around that child is something we can do easily. That will really help. And it's one small thing, but it will help.
What about the rest of you guys? Do you have any ideas based on like the research or based on some of the cases that you've seen on how to sort of mitigate the issue that's happening at the moment?
I think it is very difficult because of a backlog, and I think there's a real issue around workforce. And I think central government intervention looking both at money. I mean, it comes down to money, but also at the workforce needs of the sector to make sure we've got the right people in the right place to provide the support that families need. I think Charlotte's right, absolutely right about teams around the child working together, taking the expertise from different sectors, and I think within that working with the whole family as well, and thinking about the needs of the whole family. One thing I didn't talk about in my first bit, but I think it's important, is the impact that's been on siblings as well, and how they've been impacted by the pandemic and what that means and what support's needed. But I think making sure the right support's there, talking to families, listening to, they've been in many cases stuck at home with the children for 18 months. They've seen how their children's needs have changed, and really engaging with them on the best way to help support them.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Charlotte and Stephen have said. Again, it's a real challenge, and in a world where there's still a lot of uncertainty around what will happen, and we're approaching the winter season, and I think a lot of the families that we speak to are very nervous about what will happen, not only from a COVID point of view, because there is still a lot of apprehension with families whose children often have got very complex and severe medical needs that feed into their disability, and they're understandably very anxious about that. There's all the anxiety around, well, what will happen with services if our therapists are pulled, if they have to close the centres again, what's going to happen, and almost an apprehension to re-engage with those services until they feel sure and certain that that's going to continue, because they worry about the impact on their children, on their mental health, I suppose, of this toing and froing and things starting up and then pulling back again. And that's very, very difficult, as it is for all of us, but particularly when you're trying to navigate that world for your child and trying to get the best for them in such a turbulent time. I don't think that should be overlooked. And when services are being designed and resources being planned, often that's a very transactional thing. It's very much looking at what do we have available and how can we use it. And in some ways it needs to be, but you've got to think about that holistic picture. You've got to think about the child and the family and what impact that's having on them, and how people engage with services in order to make them effective. Because if you don't, what you're providing is never going to achieve the aims that you're looking to achieve. You've got to design it in such a way that people feel confident in using the service. And I think that all this uncertainty is making that very difficult.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine that. So it's a lot about, seeing, the whole picture rather than just focusing on one specific thing. And that sort of leads me over to my third question, which is about, is enough currently done to engage the wider team when it comes to like a child's physical development? I know you mentioned it a little bit, Charlotte, but would you mind sort of like going into a little bit more in depth with that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think in many areas, as I said, those kind of silos still exist, and it is still a case of, therapy take that and education take something separate. And it shocks me that still happens, but it does, because, I feel that our approach shouldn't be innovative, but it seems like it still is in many areas. So yeah, there are areas of silos where there is a lot more we could be doing to engage the whole team. As I said, there are some areas of really good practice where collaboration is happening and is delivering incredible results. And it, like you say, it needs that investment into a longer term view, I suppose, to achieve that. But I think as well, it's like what Holly was saying, it's such a complex world to navigate as a parent or a family member or anyone involved in this system. And we need to make sure that any approach that we are taking is something that is accessible to the whole team to facilitate more engagement from the whole team. And it's about stripping it back to that, isn't it? And about identifying shared goals across services, keeping the child and their family at the heart of that process, rather than a family being pulled between education goals, therapy goals, health goals, OT goals. It's so complex for a family to have to navigate that. And if we can strip all that away and think, okay, what is most important for this child's development and for their long-term goals and the long-term goals of the family, we can take away some of that complexity and narrow it down and really deliver amazing outcomes that will have long-term benefits to their lives. And so, I think it's about making it accessible for the whole team and identifying a shared language or a shared approach that incorporates all of that expertise.
Yeah, definitely. Is that something you recognise as well, Holly, at Jiraffe?
Yeah, I think so. I think for me, what we need to acknowledge is that the interaction that we have with children is very small. We can do a lot of work and do a lot of work to make that interaction positive and valuable for that child, but actually we're with that child for the blink of an eye in terms of their journey through this. And even the question, I suppose, when you talk about is the team doing enough, when we talk about that, it makes us think about the team, the clinicians, the educationalists, and so on and so forth, the professionals, when actually the people who are experts in the child are the child themselves and their family. And really what we should, I think, be focusing on is that holistic picture and bringing those professionals into the family rather than trying to bring the family into the team, and equipping that family to really advocate for their child in the best way possible, because the professionals involved are experts in their own particular discipline. It's very easy to gloss over the details to families, and families need that information, they need that education, and they need to revisit that, because when this information is given over to families, it's often at very, very difficult, very, very stressful times, and the retention of that information is poor. And in order for things to be designed in such a way as to fully benefit the child to the maximum degree possible, the families need to understand that. And I think there needs to be a step change in the way that we view families as part of that process, and we really need to be empowering families to take the lead role, I suppose, and bring people along with the family rather than the other way around.
Yeah, definitely. And how about you, Stephen? Have you seen anything, similar with like how to engage, wider teams when it comes to paediatric care when you've done like all of your reports and research?
Well, I think that point Holly made at the end there about working with families and empowering families is massively important. One of the things that the evaluation we commissioned of the voluntary sector found was that the voluntary sector actually stepped up really well when the statutory sector fell away, and where it worked, there were sort of key competencies that the sector showed, and one of those was understanding, working with families to understand their needs. And another was around working flexibly and working in partnership. And I think there's lessons there that the voluntary sector has learned, and we'll be looking to support in our role as a coalition to support the voluntary sector in taking those forward. But I think there's lessons for the statutory sector as well in how you respond to parents and children's needs, how you understand those, how you support their mental and emotional health as well as their physical health, and how you work flexibly and work together. It feels there's a lot of discussions, well, perennially, but particularly at the moment, around joint working between health and social care for adults. I don't hear enough of that, about that, for what that means for children and how to support children, and obviously that there's that massive third dimension for children in terms of education and how those services work together and have shared goals, shared understandings, and not shifting responsibility between themselves, but actually are properly around the child and the family and providing the support they need.
Great. So my next question is around sort of like equipment provision, and that's starting out with you, Holly, where I'd like to know what are sort of the differences when it comes to adult and pediatric equipment provision, and is there a difference?
Yeah, very much so. I would say there's a difference. Obviously, I work and Jenkins and Jiraffe work predominantly in paediatrics, and that's the area that I know most about. I can't speak a huge amount to adults because we don't work in that field very much. I think that one of the common misconceptions when it comes to the equipment itself is that you can take a piece of adult equipment and just replicate that and make it smaller for a child, and that just isn't the case. There are so many things that go into the design and the engineering of a piece of equipment which is truly going to benefit a child. Of course, you can fit a child into a smaller version of an adult chair physically, they will go in there, but is that going to create the best outcomes for that child? Probably not. You need to be thinking not only about the dimensions of the product. Children have different body proportions to adults, for example, so you want to design something that is specifically going to match the body proportions of a child rather than of an adult. You need equipment that's going to grow, because children grow, which adults don't usually. So you need to be able to tailor that equipment so that it meets the needs of the growing child. And also bear in mind the fact that children, more so than adults, have a lot of changes to the presentation of their disability. Various different things impact on that. The stage of development that they're at in their lives will impact on that. Medications can change that very, very quickly. You can have children whose presentations change vastly over the space of a few weeks, and you need equipment which can be adjustable to cope with the various different demands that may come up for that child during the usable life of that piece of equipment, and that's really important. But also, when you're thinking about equipment for children, you've got to think about the environment that that equipment's going to be going into. You've got to think about, actually, is this child, children are children at the end of the day, and they want to play and they want to have fun and they want to be engaged with their peers, and children with disabilities are no different to typically developing children in that, in so many ways. And you should be using equipment to help inclusivity and not to hinder it. And a child in a piece of equipment that looks very scary is going to be scared going into that piece of equipment, and their peers are going to feel apprehensive about approaching them, and that's going to damage the social interaction, which is so vital to them. It's not just about physical development, it's about social and emotional development as well. And equipment should be there as an aid to those things, not as a barrier to them. So you want to be designing equipment that bears all of that in mind as well, and that looks attractive and that looks fun, and that families want to engage with as well. There's a very sad kind of thing that people talk about in the industry, where they look at equipment as a very expensive clothes source, and you see that time and time again. And that goes back to what I was saying previously about education for families. If the families don't understand the vital role that that equipment is playing in their child's development to aid that child as they grow, they won't see the value in using it. And then if it's not attractive and the child doesn't want to go into it, and actually it's difficult to use, all of these things play into worse outcomes for children. And so good quality design and understanding the environment that the equipment for children is going to go into is absolutely vital in it being an effective tool to use to aid the development of disabled children. And then you move on to funding and all of those sorts of things, and you understand that even the best piece of equipment in the world isn't going to provide any benefit if it doesn't get funded. And funding structures are just so complex, and it's so sad, because there's excellent products out there for children and young people. Really, cutting edge things are available, but the funding often isn't there, and we have such a reactive view to funding. We will fund things when there's a problem there, but as I said before, we can prevent those problems from occurring, and in doing so, we can not only give children a better opportunity, we can give them less pain, we can give them this life where they actually are healthier long term. And we would save money by doing that. Ultimately, to the economy, we would save money because that child wouldn't need as much complex intervention later on. So not only do they have a better life, but it's better for the economy. And it's better for the family. If the family have less stress, their child has less complications resulting from their condition, perhaps some of those anxieties and some of those mental health issues that are so prevalent within families of children with additional needs could be lessened. And that again helps the family unit, and that helps the child, but it helps the wider economy as well. And all of these things could be aided if we took a different viewpoint, if we tried to invest up front in a better future rather than waiting for the inevitable to happen and children to be in pain and to have complications that we then have to correct. So I think equipment has a big part to play, and I think that we could do more around equipment to make it more beneficial because the opportunities are there.
Nice. Diane, you have something on your mind?
Yes, I was just listening to that, and I think that resonated with all of us actually, about this sort of earlier intervention actually leading to far better outcomes indeed for the child, the family, society as a whole, and actually a cost-effective kind of outcome as well. And I guess the frustration that we all share, and I don't know what the answer is, and that's the question, I guess, is what can we do to get that message to people that actually make the decisions about funding and structures? That's the question.
It's a big question. It's a big question, and I think there's a lot of work going on through agencies such as the Disabled Children's Partnership that really do raise awareness of this issue. We've done a lot of work with New Life in the past, who are heavily involved, and I know a part of the Disabled Children's Partnership as well. And I think it's like anything, isn't it? You just have to keep plugging away. You have to keep repeating the message because it's an important message, and if it's falling on deaf ears, you have to say it louder, because actually the young people that we work with often can't advocate for themselves, and we've got a duty and a responsibility to do that for them.
Yeah, I guess what we can do, so for the end of this, I know we're going to put together a resource pack with all the links and so on, and I guess the plea is to everybody listening to this webinar that's involved in provision is kind of lobby hard, raise it with whether it's your MPs or your local kind of groups, charities, etc. And let's just keep shouting and see whether we can actually get some change.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the reasons why we're doing these webinars as well, is to sort of like create that awareness. And yes, Stephen, I bet you have lots of things you want to say to this. Well,
I was just going to say we do keep shouting and trying to make the case, and we have as our sort of overarching call around our campaigning has been what we call our 3 pillars, which are firstly that we should see disabled children placed as a higher priority within policy and within government, and at both national and local level there should be clear sort of points of accountability so that services are working together rather than compartmentalised. We know responsibility in central government sits between different departments, and at local level, local authorities and the health services sits in different places. So having some real coordination, and as a sort of figurehead for that, we call for a Minister for Disabled Children. Secondly, I'm not sure I'll get my pillars in the right order, but it doesn't matter. Secondly, money, funding is important, and sufficient funding. And thirdly, really looking at how the system works and how it works together, and whether the legal responsibilities and the financial responsibilities work or place perverse incentives in place. And we've called for a as well as sort of large-scale additional funding to plug funding gaps, we've called for a smaller innovation fund to really work at to fund projects that can evidence what works, encourage joint working, and be a way of spreading best practice. And actually tomorrow we'll be publishing some more economic research which will show what how the health and social care funding gap for disabled children support has sadly grown. But it'll also show, and the point Holly made about the economic case, that if you invest, it actually pays off. The reduced cost of more expensive later interventions, the fact that parents can actually work You know, so many parent carers have to give up their jobs or turn down promotions, or so they can be more economically active and, you know, candidly pay more tax. And actually the children and young people themselves have got more chance of moving on to an adulthood where they can work and be economically active, and again, you know, pay more tax. So actually the analysis will show that it makes financial economic sense to invest. I mean, God, the moral case should be strong enough, shouldn't it? But sometimes it feels like it's not. And if you case, that's there as well. So we'll be publishing that tomorrow. And
Great.
Oh, lovely. Holly, you have also something you'd like to say?
Yeah, I was just wanted to pick up a little bit more on that point about budgets and funding and how that all works. And what we see often when we're engaging with services and talking to them about exactly this issue about how that investment now will save money in the future, an issue that we frequently come across is that the type of equipment, the preventative postural care equipment that we supply is often funded through social care. And the saving, a large part of that saving will be to the NHS. And the way that those budgets are set out really at the very highest level from central government needs to be looked at in order for this message to get through loud and clear, because cynically, the business managers, I suppose, within social services will look at that and say, but we're taking from our budget, we're not going to get that back, it's going to come back in a different area, and that needs to be joined up better, because there's no incentive there when you look at it from a purely economic point of view. If you are in one of those services, that incentive just isn't there. That needs to be joined up better, because it would be better for the children, it would be better for the economy, but it isn't necessarily, the way it's set out at the moment, better for the individual services, and that's a flaw in the way that things are done at the moment. And I think also we mustn't forget schools in this as well. The way that funding is delivered to schools is really unclear at the moment, and schools really often struggle to understand within the money that they're given, where is the priority here for equipment? How much should they be spending on equipment? And we see a huge variety of budgets set out in schools, and some schools really do treat equipment as a priority, and you see great outcomes for the children in those schools, and they tend to be the schools that take on things like the MOVE programme and other things that it's all encompassing within the school, it's a real priority, and other schools don't or can't, and there's no real guidance there for head teachers, especially within mainstream head teachers who maybe have a handful of children with additional physical needs in school, and it's a real challenge for them, and always the losers in this are the children, and they shouldn't be. We should be designing and orchestrating this so that they're at the centre of it, and they always benefit from the structures that are in place.
How about you, Charlotte? Have you experienced anything in relation to funding in schools in your daily work life with MOVE?
Yeah, totally. I think I just mirror everything that Stephen and Holly have said. We see exactly the same across our work that we do. And I think there is huge disparity in different local authorities, in different schools. And I'm still shocked all the time by that disparity and that completely different approach that happens sometimes kind of a few miles down the road from each other. And I think, yes, you know, going back to a point that Holly made, it's about getting families and education teams and the whole team to understand, going back to that equipment use, you know, there is, like you say, there's so much you can be done to provide the equipment, but then if people don't understand how to use it and aren't, you know, skilled in using that to develop motor skills, it doesn't get used in it, and then they're less likely to fund it in the future. So I think, yeah, it's a huge challenge that we definitely see across the sector as well. And it does require that longer term thinking, and it's something that we constantly talk about, is you will see the benefits down the line if you can invest as early as possible. But like Holly said, the funding structures are so complex and bizarre and siloed off that people aren't that interested at the moment. So we have to look at how we can reimagine those funding structures. And it's something that we would love to explore more in work that we've got coming up as well.
Lovely. Yeah. So as we've sort of like discussed already, it seems like there's some issues in terms of like families getting that bit of awareness and bit of training. So Charlotte, do you have any sort of advice where can family go if they want to gain that bit of support? Are there any like organizations? Are there any funding channels they can go to? It'd be great to hear your point of view on that.
Yeah, I think there are definitely pockets of funding and support available, and as Stephen said, I think the voluntary sector has done an incredible job over the past couple of years of stepping up and adapting and delivering additional services to support families. And I think there's a lot that other sectors could learn from how the voluntary sector has delivered that. You know, the work of SIBS as a charity is fantastic to support siblings of disabled children. Contact, I know, do incredible work as well. And I think there's so much we can learn from those type of organisations. And I think the point that Stephen raised around an innovation fund would be incredible, because we've noticed it in our work with an NHS team. There are so many things we can learn from each other. And if we just have more opportunities to do that, I think we'll be able to drive real innovation across the sector. So yeah, there are pockets of support available. I think something that I feel incredibly passionate about, and we've been talking about a lot recently actually, is, you know, because the system is so stretched, the funding is so stretched, there is such a gap in funding, which has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. The language around securing that funding and support is constantly referred to as, you know, fighting to get our needs met or battling to get my voice heard. And parents have to endure this kind of approach of a fight and a constant battle to access that support. And I think it has a massive impact on families' mental health. And something that we talk about a lot is actually, rather than looking at that deficit model, that medical model where we're constantly looking at all the conditions that a child has, or impairments or additional needs for funding, if we can adopt a strengths-based approach from as early as possible and start to just have more conversations and use more frameworks that look at children's goals, their skills they already have, their aspirations for their own life, we can, I believe, do a lot more to empower families from the beginning to be advocating for their children's aspirations, desires and wants, rather than having to fight and be constantly focused on, you know, a deficit model. So strengths, you know, it's something that's very small, I suppose, in the grand scheme of things, but I think a strengths-based approach is something that we can all take away and incorporate into our work. And if we can do that from as early as possible, we raise aspirations, and it all comes back to the longer term gains of being less reliant on services, less reliant on equipment and everything like that. So it all ties in together, doesn't it? But I just think there is so much we can do to support parents and families as they navigate that incredibly complex world of having a disabled child, which it shouldn't be the case. But yeah.
Great. And how about you, Holly? Has anything been put in place in Jiraffe in terms of like providing better support for families, or have you partnered up with any other organizations, especially with what's happened with COVID, to give family that bit of extra support?
Yeah, absolutely. I think right back at the beginning of the pandemic, the first thing that struck us at Jiraffe was just how much of a wide gap we could see was about to open up. As soon as children were told to stay at home, you know, although many of the children that we work with were entitled to still go into school because of their additional needs, that gave them the option, a lot of the schools just couldn't facilitate that to that degree. And a lot of the families were very, very, very nervous about sending their children into school. There was a lot of fear around that. And we knew that what was going to result from that was a gap in provision for those children, and that their conditions could quite quickly worsen. It doesn't take long, it only takes a very short space of time, a few weeks out of equipment, for irreparable damage to happen to a growing child. And we wanted to try and avoid that as much as possible. at Giraffe, we tried to be really dynamic around that situation and to come up with a lot of new services to help address those gaps that we could see opening up. So we did things like just moving of equipment for free between school and home, so that equipment that children did rely on that was normally kept at school, that's big and bulky that you can't take home in a car, we would take home for children so they could still access their standing program, for example, at home, rather than being, and we didn't know at the time how long it was going to be, but we now know that it turned out to be a long period of time, rather than going for that long stretch of time without being able to stand, because that has a significant impact on children. We introduced our emergency posture provision scheme. So that was really aimed at those children that needed equipment, and rather than having to go through the usual funding channels to purchase a piece of equipment, which takes a long time, often too long, even at the best of times, but certainly when all the resources and all the attention was focused in other areas, this gave a very low cost and very, very quick, not for profit for us, but a very, very quick way of getting equipment out to those children urgently that could be reviewed regularly, so they could have that piece of equipment for a few months, and then actually if the situation had eased and things were more back to normal, then they could purchase that piece of equipment or go on and do whatever else it was they were going to do. But it was designed as a stopgap, and both of those services were really, really successful. We did a lot of work on webinars ourselves, actually. It was really interesting for us, because there are all these things that you talk about wanting to do. We want to provide this additional support, we want to be able to provide this education, and you just end up without the time to do it often. And that presented us a real opportunity to take those people that are more clinically focused within our business, who weren't out and about working with the children because of the situation that we found ourselves in. And that's been great, actually. It's been really, really good for us to be able to get invested in that piece of work, and hopefully that will add value to families. We've got a place that we can direct them now to do that. But I think, you know, there's so much out there. As Charlotte said, there are so many places that parents can turn to, but often it's either a situation of there's so much they don't actually know where to start, or they're so in the situation, they're so in the middle of the tornado that actually they can't see what's around them because there's so much noise going on. And I think our job as people who are involved in that is to help to signpost them. And there's too many for me to talk about now, because it depends on the absolute specifics of the situation. But I think if there are any parents kind of watching this recording, for them to just know that they can get in touch with the professionals that are involved, or with any of the organisations like ourselves, and we can help signpost them to relevant support for them. And I'm sure that you'll probably put some links in the resources that you're going to compile at the end of this as well.
I think that's really great, Holly. Charlotte, do you have something you'd like to say?
I think, yeah, just picking up on the point that Holly made about, you know, the ways that organisations have adapted in the last year and the opportunities that have arisen as well. I think we've seen a very, very similar. We've had a very experience to Holly in terms of we adapted very quickly and did a huge amount online, which has been brilliant. But I think also our schools have adapted really, really well. And I think that the incredible effort that the schools have put in over the last 18 months or so has been brilliant, and has actually led to a lot of innovation that's happened in those settings. And I just think it sounds like quite a bleak picture at the moment, but there are pockets of brilliance that are happening, and I think it has given us a chance to adapt what we do. And I know in our very small charity we have gone through a complete overhaul really of how we do everything, and I think we've really delivered a much better standard of service to our customers, to families and to schools. So I think, yeah, there is a real opportunity here to take those learnings and to provide better support to families using some of these experiences.
Oh, that's really great. I'm sure, Stephen, that Disabled Children Partnerships have loads of different resources, and you've done so many campaigns as well to provide that bit of support for families.
Yeah, I mean, in what, in many respects is quite a depressing conversation this morning about the problem. It's really lovely to hear, a whole number of our organisations name checked in the discussion, because the voluntary sector, as I said, the evidence shows responded really well to the pandemic and showed the flexibility, and Charlotte talked about what they've done in changing how they provided support and services, and that's just one example of one of our members and how things have changed. A lot of our member organisations provide support to parents, help with that navigation, and also actually that emotional support and help, because sometimes actually what you need is someone to rant at down the phone, or other families who've been through the same thing to you, to be able to just sort of let off steam and know you're somebody, is more than just nodding sympathetically, but actually really understands what you've been through, because they've walked in your shoes. So so have a look at our website and our members' links to our members' websites. I'd say to people, things on there, but a few to point at. Some organisations have sort of closed Facebook groups or other things. Contact MenCat. Contact have a helpline, which is great for advice and support and help in navigating the system. But they also now have a one-to-one listening ear service, which, as I say, you can book an appointment with an advisor, and it really is just a chance to talk about whatever you want to, and it can be that emotional support and that chance to let off steam and metaphorically, kick the cat, not literally but metaphorically, but just to and have someone who will understand what you're going through and help support, because I think there is both that need for the practical support and sometimes and also the emotional support. So I think the voluntary sector is uniquely well placed to help families do that. It's a pity it's needed. It's a pity the system's so complex that you need that help navigating it and fighting it, but it is out there if parents look for it.
That's great. So our next question, I'm sure you guys are aware, our campaign that sort of like revolves around this webinar is called Do No Harm, Know Your Power. So it's about preventing harm, but also, like you guys have said previously, empower families, clinicians, etc. So what can you do as a clinician or as a parent or as a carer when it comes to preventing that bit of harm in paediatric care? I
think probably the answer to this is going to be a bit of a go around things we've already said. It feels good to have some discussion.
That's fine.
What we've always known, I think, is what it's about is having the right support in place early at the right time, having services working together, properly listening to parents and to children and young people, so you really understand what's happening, what their situation is, what their needs are, and as I said, taking a whole family approach. I think we're in a particular position at the moment, as I said, that clinicians, the system really need to recognise that children's needs have changed over the last year and a half. As I said, missed therapies, operations, other procedures mean that children's and young people's needs will have changed and become more complex. And that means just providing what you're providing before may not actually be the right thing, and the piece of equipment that they've relied on for the last 18 months may no longer be the right piece of equipment, or the therapy may no longer be provided at the appropriate level. So really understanding how needs have changed. I think actually need to recognise there's a lot of unmet need out there. Routine assessments and reviews haven't taken place. The kind of normal opportunities where needs are identified, health visitors, early year settings in schools, those interactions just may not have been happening, and so the normal picking up of needs may have been missed. So the system needs to have a proper understanding of children's needs and tackle that backlog in assessment. And as we talked about, obviously having the right equipment is vital, and I think having it available in all parts of a child's life and not sort of compartmentalizing, that was easy for me to say, compartmentalizing equipment into one bit of a child's life. And I think one of the lessons from the first lockdown was that children saw equipment which they relied upon locked away in the school when the school doors locked, and so when they were at home trying to do access home learning, they couldn't, because they didn't have the right equipment, because it was still in the school, and because the school owned it and it wasn't associated with the child and wasn't provided and built around the child, or the provision built around the child and the family's needs. So I think there's some real lessons to be learned there. And I think there's also, you know, we learned a lot about what works in digital delivery, and over the last 18 months, 19 months, there's been some real massive strides and real successes in how services have been digitally delivered, and how that can work really well, can sometimes work better than what was provided before, and can have real benefits. But there's also massive risks in that of a digital divide, and that's not just about having the right kit and connectivity. It's about having the right understanding of children and families, having the right support to make the most of it, and not being scared off early on, or not understanding, and therefore the kit's sitting there and just not being used, which, you know, others talked about in terms of other equipment as well. So making the most of what we've learned about digital delivery is a really important opportunity. Families, children and families need the right support, and it mustn't be the only option. It needs to be part of a blended approach rather than a, we've got a new way of delivering now and that's it, take it or leave it.
How about the rest of you guys? Holly, do you have anything you would like to add to what Stephen said?
Yeah, I think for me, definitely everything that Stephen said, it's about just breaking it down. And, you know, remembering that however busy we are, to take the time to understand that child and their needs, and to make sure that the goals that we're working towards are the right goals to be working towards, and it's the right time to be working towards those goals. It's much better to work towards 1 or 2 goals and be fully invested in them than to try and work towards 8, 9 or 10 different things and actually not really be able to get anywhere very quickly. I think just making sure that we review regularly, that's a challenge, but we can empower the people that are closer to the child, the people that they're interacting with every day in school, the families, to really see the changes that would require a physio or an OT to come back in and do another review. So we can do that more, and families want to be able to do that. They want to be able to understand more about their child. They want to be able to say this is okay, or actually I need more support, and be able to react to that support better, so the services to have the capability to be able to react to that when the families need them to, rather than weeks and weeks down the line when things have progressed further. So I think for me it's just around the way that we look at things and making sure that we are doing the right thing at the right time, and that we're allowing that we're moving at pace, but we're also allowing the time to focus on those things, and it's about regular review.
How about you, Charlotte?
Yeah, I've been like nodding all the way through that. Yes. I completely agree with everything everyone said this whole webinar, and I think that's exactly it. For us, it's about everything I've said the whole way through, utilising the expertise, the resource, the capacity from the whole team. I think it's getting out of that day-to-day silo way of working of what are my, you know, therapy team's aims or whatever it may be, and looking at the child at the centre of that programme, that situation, and understanding how we can all work together, utilising a framework that everybody can understand, that is accessible for everybody, to deliver the best possible outcomes for that child, and focusing, which is something we talk about in Move all the time, focusing on 1 or 2 key goals that are going to deliver the best possible outcome for that child and their family. So exactly like what we've been saying, putting the children and the family at the centre of that programme, working towards goals that will make the biggest difference to their lives, and just thinking a little bit differently about it, rather than getting caught up in that day-to-day service delivery approach. So yeah, I think it's doable. There's areas it's happening, and I think we just need to replicate that and hopefully deliver that across the country.
Great. Well, we are actually at our final question of today's webinar. So that is, do you guys have any tips for attendees that they can take away to apply to the day-to-day clinical practice while providing pediatric care? I'm not sure who would want to sort of start with that one.
I'm happy to say, I'd say listen to the family, listen to parents, understand their needs, understand their situation, and don't just view the world through your narrow particular professional specialism.
That's a good one. How about you, Holly?
Yeah, obviously, agree with what Stephen said, and I think I would say build in reviews as well. Empower parents, make sure that they've got the information and the knowledge, revisit those topics with parents and be prepared to go back and review. We know that children get the best out of their programs and the best out of their equipment when it's regularly reviewed and adjusted to meet their needs in line with their goals. That's where you really get those incremental gains and you really provide the best for the child. In those areas where there's more of an approach of provide something and then that's it off the caseload, although it's better than nothing, you're not maximizing your opportunity there, and equipment's expensive. So if we're going to provide that, let's provide that and make it work. Let's provide the support around it so that it's really, really effective for that child, because that's where we're going to have the biggest impact.
Great. And how about you, Charlotte?
Yeah, I think echoing both of those and thinking about the long-term outcomes, trying to look at the long-term benefits of that investment now, and what outcomes you're going to deliver for that child and their family down the line, I think is something, an attitude or a mindset to keep in your mind as you continue in your work is something really important.
Great. Well, that was it. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing all of your insights. I think it's been really, really interesting. And I think it's going to benefit a lot of people. And as Diane mentioned, we're going to have all of the resources that you guys have been referencing on a separate slide after the webinar. So hopefully, parents and clinicians and carers can use that at least as a starting point. And then, like Holly said, you're always welcome to reach out to any of our organizations to learn more. Do you have any final comments, Diane, that you would like to add on? Famous last word?
Just a bit of an observation, just a massive thank you again to all our panellists. I think that was a fantastic amount of information and reflection and some really positive thoughts there. And I guess just moving from Charlotte's kind of turning things into a positive is, post-pandemic sometimes offers us a chance to do things differently, and maybe this is our chance to look at these beacons of best practice where we're seeing really good team working and interventions going on, and then use the innovation kind of funding through Stephen's organisation to raise that as a beacon of intervention and innovation and make it happen. Maybe do things a bit differently. Not always a bad thing to on the back of what we've all been through. So yeah, massive thank you, and plenty of hope I think for the future, which is good.
Thank you again for watching our webinar about early intervention in pediatric care. We hope it's given you some new perspectives and insights into the challenges in pediatric care and how to solve those challenges through early intervention. To sum up the key points from the webinar, the pandemic has had a massive effect on the mental and physical health of children with disabilities, with conditions worsening and an increase in anxiety and depression. There have been cases where the worsening of these conditions are irreversible, and generally, children will have better outcomes if their needs are dealt with at an early stage. To integrate early intervention in pediatric care, there needs to be communication between all different parts involved with the individual child's care, i.e. parents, carers, schools, clinicians, etc. Despite the pandemic, there are wonderful examples of good practices for early intervention in pediatric care. In these examples, there's been a collaboration between the educational system, therapists, and families, mainly through the aid of the voluntary sector. We hope that this is a step in the right direction towards understanding and integrating early intervention in pediatric care. We hope to inspire clinicians and the key decision makers to empower them to make the necessary changes to improve our healthcare system. We are more than ready to include and gather more people and organizations in our movement towards a healthcare system where we can avoid harm and make sure the best outcomes for clients are achieved. Thank you for your time.